Close your eyes if you will. Let the weight of the day fall away, like dust from the prow of a ship passing through the stars. Breathe slowly, in and out. Let each breath follow the steady rhythm of a machine that has learned to keep time with a living heart. Far beyond the warm, breathing world you know, beyond oceans and continents and the small, bright lamps of cities, there is a place called Macragge. Say the name softly. Let it sit on your tongue like the echo of a bell in a cathedral, deep, round, and patient. Macragge is a fortress carved from rock and iron, and 1,000 years of ritual. It is a monastery of war, a place of ordered light and measured shadow, of corridors that remember the tread of 1,000 ordered boots. Tonight the sky above Macragge is a plain of dark silk, embroidered with bright, indifferent stars. The void presses its attention like a calm hand on a sleeping brow. There is no hurry there. Nothing yawns or screams. The galaxy spins with a slow, unfathomable patience, and within that patience the fortress monastery breathes. If you could stand upon one of Macragge's high battlements, wrapped in a cloak faster than winter and older than fear, you would hear a sound like a distant choir of metal. It is the soft, constant hum of the armor vaults, millions of servomotors settling into rest, pneumatic valves sighing shut, the last clicks of maintenance bots sliding along racks of power armor. The sound is not loud, it is domestic. It is the noise a house makes when everyone sleeps, comforting and ordinary and perfectly ordinary enough to be trusted. Listen to that hum, let it live at the edge of your hearing. Beneath it, there comes another sound, the distant, folded cadence of battle hymns. They are more like a memory than a song, phrases of old liturgy repeated by voices that have learned to make even prayer sound precise. Chant after chant weaves through the vaults and across the terraces, carried on a wind that never stumbles. The hymns are not celebratory. They are measured, like the sound a clock makes as it marks the steady passage of time. They remind the men of the order of what they were created to be. Instruments of precision, living statutes of duty and discipline. The men you will meet tonight are the Ultramarines, and when you say their name aloud, you do not speak of a single face. You speak of a shape, the blue of their armor, deep as a distant sea, with heraldry carved into it like truth carved into stone. You speak of shoulders broad as gates and helms that mirror the sky. You speak of a way of moving so practiced it becomes meditation, the measured step, the breath in the counting of a formation, the ritual of maintenance and the prayer beneath hands that have never fully warmed to another hand's touch. They keep the lights neat on Macragge. They keep their rituals precise. When the last sun sinks into the pale gulf of horizon and the lamps of the monastery bloom, they close the heavy doors in implacable, ceremonial motions. Keys turn in locks that are older than many planets. Each lock makes a sound like a conclusion. Each conclusion is celebrated with silence. You might imagine, if you like, that a place of such strictness would be full of noise. Iron clashing, orders shouted, the red flare of alarms. Tonight, however, there is a hush almost like the hush of libraries in the small towns you used to walk through as a child. The hush of books and dust and thought. It is the hush of a people who have practiced quiet until quiet itself has become a discipline. In the inner halls the furnaces pulse with patient fires. Men in simple robes trace fingers across icons as if counting rosaries. Servitors, a chorus of mechanized servants with hands like tools and eyes like polished brass, glide through the corridors, carrying trays of medicines, polished oil for armor joints, and small panes of amber light that fit into the sockets of old machines like tiny, obedient moons. Their movements are slow and precise. They are not foolish. They are merely deliberate, as if someone somewhere has written an instruction and they are following it to the letter. Watch the brothers as they move. They are not merely soldiers. In their rituals there is a kind of worship. There is a cadence to their prayers, and in that cadence is a comfort so deep that it smooths the edges off of fear. The chaplains lead with voices like low trumpets, the sermon a lesson in order, how to fold a cloak, how to clean a bolt, how to measure a life in terms of utility and honor. It is a sermon that takes a shape you can almost set beside the bed and point at. This is useful, this is useful, this is useful. Even when they sleep, their minds are trained to wake on signal. Their rest is not chaotic. It is a series of precisely timed naps, each measured to be long enough to heal and short enough to maintain vigilance. It is a strange kind of peace, like the peace of an organism that has learned to keep a third eye open even while it sleeps. There is a particular room in Macragge called the Librarius. In that room, under glass and light, a different sort of silence holds. Librarians, men of order who practice a craft older than most thinking men, sit with relics and words and echoes. They are scholars of the mind as well as the body, and they keep the recorded thoughts of their brotherhood like a gardener keeps seeds. Catalogued, labeled, stored at the precise humidity of ritual. Tonight, the Librarius brings news that is careful and small. A junior archivist has reported a faint ringing on an old psychic channel, a tone like a bell heard in another house. At first the sound was dismissed as a crackle on an old machine, a stray echo from long-dead equipment. Then the librarian listened. He told the chapter master about it in the slow, measured voice of men who believe in paperwork, and the chapter master marked it down and nodded. Not every anomaly is a thing to fear. Some are simply curiosities, but the librarian persisted in listening. He had an ear trained to hear what others ignore. He sat in the candle quiet of the librarius until the hum of his own mind matched the hum of the vaults. He waited, and then he heard it. It was a memory, not the kind of memory that belonged to a single living brother, the scent of a brother's oil or the exact pitch of a captain's laugh, but a memory that tasted like otherness. It came as a whisper, thin at first, like the paper edge of a letter sliding past a seal. It smelled of old metal and long-ago rain. It carried images of faces that were not ultramarine faces, hands that had held different tools, a lullaby in tongues older than the current time on Macragge. The librarian set the memory on the table between his hands as one might set a fragile bowl. He blinked slowly and felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand to attention. He catalogued it. He categorized it. He put it into a folder and labeled it. Echo unassigned. It was what he should have done. It was what the Codex said to do. The Codex Astartes is a great and careful thing. It teaches order as a law and discipline as virtue. Its prescriptions are small miracles. How to move a formation to hold a hill, how to pray while you aim, how to mend a blade with an exacting hand. On Macragge, the Codex is more than a book. It is a rhythm. It is a hymn. It is the precise architecture of their world. The Ultramarines are faithful to it as water is faithful to the riverbed. And yet, on this night, as the librarian sealed the folder and placed it into the archive, there was a tiny disturbance at the edge of the archive's light. It was barely a thing, the way a thought might flicker in and out behind your eyes when you are almost asleep. The archivist felt the hair on his forearm prickle with a sensation that had no name. It was as if a stranger had touched the hem of his robe. Outside the librarius, the fortress remembered how to breathe. The gate towers exhaled a sheet of thin fog that glittered with motes of engineered pollen meant to preserve the stone. A patrol of brothers moved through the outer bailey, their boots laying down a rhythm that could have been a lullaby for a child. The banners overhead drifted in a wind that had been designed, in part, by mathematicians. The angle of each fold was calculated to catch starlight so that, when the chapter marched past, they would look like a river of blue and gold. You might picture them now circular, orderly, kneeling in the great chapel to run fingers along ancient names carved into marble. Each name is a small monument to duty. Each saint remembered is another measured step inward to the fortress's heart. When they pray, they do not plead. They recite. There is comfort in the repetition. There is safety in the sameness. And yet beneath the soft choir and the smooth polish, there is a thinness to their sleep. Like glass, perfection is clear and reflects, and it breaks in a way that makes sound startles itself. The monks who keep their armor pristine are the same ones who, in the late watches, pause and stare at their own hands as if seeing them for the first time. The hands belong to brothers. They have the scars of many battles, faint lines like old maps and names. But occasionally a brother will turn those hands over and find a mark that was not his. A small, angular scar he cannot place, or a faint blue ink that spells nothing at all. This is the first sort of unease. Small things that do not add up, a prayer recited out of rhythm, a line in a ledger that has been crossed and rewoven with no recorded mending. They are not yet alarms. They are merely hints, soft, like a draft under a door. There is another sort of intimacy on Macragge that is quieter than ritual, and it is the intimacy of maintenance. The power armor that the Ultramarines wear is not merely a suit. It is a second body shaped to fit a first. It speaks to the wearer in clicks and pressures, and the warmth of metal settling against skin. Brothers who spend months in campaign learn to listen to their armor. They can tell when a servo has a hairline fault by the way it hums under stress. They can tell the difference between a healthy joint and one that will betray them at the worst possible moment. They clean the plate and tend the seals like a lover tending a wound. Tonight the armor vaults keep their slow vigil. The suits stand like sleeping colossi on their racks. Between each plate of blue you can imagine the shadow of a man counted as brother and kept safe by ritual. The suits smell of ozone and talc, and the faint, stubborn scent of oil. If you have ever slept with the window open on a summer night, you know how smells can arrive like old friends. Here the smells are older. They remember battles and long nights and the tang of iron that is as common as breath. There is a warmth to it, even now. Even as the libraria seals the echo into its folder, even as the brothers drift through their quiet prayers, there is an acceptance to the order that comforts. They have traded certain things for their security. Individuality folded into a greater name, private memory exchanged for public purpose. When a boy is taken into service here, he is given a number, but also a place, to belong. Many men would call that kindness. This is how the chapter keeps itself steady, by trading the wildness of self for the trust of the group. They are safe because they are all parts of a well-lubricated machine. And yet at the edge of that safety, something watches the seams. Outside the walls, the ocean of stars is patient. Inside the walls, the silence is practiced. The librarian, his fingers smelling faintly of old incense and the cold iron of his implements, closes the archive and walks slowly toward the chapel. His boots make no noise on the polished stone. Sound here is a practiced thing, a thing to be conserved like heat in winter. He pauses under a carved relief of a long-dead Primarch, touches the cold marble for a heartbeat, and then continues. As he passes the armor vaults, he hears, for a heartbeat hardly longer than a blink, a sound that is not the hum of servos. It is almost like laughter, an involuntary noise that the stone should not make. The sound is too small to be a thing. It is more like a vibration in the ribs of the monastery, a sympathetic response to an unseen strike. He stops. He looks at the slotted racks where the blue plates sleep. He thinks of the echo he has catalogued. He thinks of the faces he heard in the whisper, faces that did not belong to anyone living on Macragge. He feels, for the first time in many years, the prickling shadow of a question forming at the base of his skull. Questions are dangerous things in places that measure the world by the precision of their answers. They are drafts that let uncertainty in. They bend the edges of a map until nothing can be read. The librarian breathes again. He straightens, and in the calm, as if to reassure himself, he whispers the old litany. The words are small and worn, the kind of words that have been said by people who live by the rhythm of ritual. They smooth him like a hand across a bed. Outside, the wind carries the chapel's hymn into the outer courtyards where sentinels keep their slow vigil. The rhythm of their boots is a lullaby. It is a promise of continuity, that tomorrow they will stand again, measure again, defend again. The fortress will keep its shape. The codex will be followed. The lights will come up, the keys will be turned, the archive will be opened and closed, and the chapter will continue. And yet in the quietest hours, those hours between midnight and dawn when minds slip like unmoored boats, There is the possibility of listening to something else. There are echoes that do not belong, memories that smell like rain but carry foreign words, a small laughter under the armor vaults, a scuff on a ledger that was never made. These are gentle things now. They do not scream. They do not break stone. They are merely the first notes of an unfamiliar tune. Sleep, if you will, and let the hum of the armor vaults be your metronome. Let the distant hymns fold you into a warm, regulated darkness. Think of Macragge as a sleeping giant that keeps watch even while it dreams. Know that order is a comfort, that ritual is a blanket, that brothers stand in rows, steady as columns, keeping the world measured. Hold that image close. Let it be the pillow upon which your own eyelids rest. The night is calm now. The fortress breathes. The librarian places the echo into its folder and walks on. The hymn continues to unspool like a ribbon, and as it does, there is a tiny, unreadable thing at the edge of the light, watching the seams where perfection meets the world. Sleep. In the morning the archive will open again, the ledger will be checked, and the chapter will continue as it always has. For tonight, allow the hush to hold you. Let the hum be as steady as a heartbeat. It is an odd, almost laboratory way to measure a life. A line of tiny nicks along a rim. The way a heraldic inlay catches light a fraction more brightly where a hand had once rested. The faint crescent where a shoulder plate had been struck in a battle whose name men no longer remembered. For many of the chapter, these marks are a map of meaning. For a captain, they are a record kept in metal rather than memory. Neat, legible, permanent. The Ultramarines do not mark time the way ordinary men do. They do not weigh themselves in birthdays or in the small, private anniversaries of lovers and children. They mark time by service rotations, by the interval between muster calls, by how many times the Codex Astartes was consulted before a campaign. Guilliman's law is their calendar. The Primarch's hand is the hand that points the hour. This is not cruelty. It is architecture. It is a deliberate engineering of the mind, a shaping meant to make a species of men into a single, unstoppable instrument. They called it perfection by obedience, the small phrase that stitched up the wounds of individuality and smoothed them into the seamless cuirass of collective purpose. It is simple in its logic. It is ruthless in its consequences. The genetic legacy of Roboute Guilliman is an old and careful thing. It is not simply the carrying of genes through centuries. It is 1,000 small interventions made by men who believed, each in his way, that biology could be improved by ritual and by law. The gene seed is a litany, a biological scripture. It contains the handprint of generations, a layered manuscript of engineered virtue. Where a normal child inherits hair and bone, a recruit here inherited doctrine, tendencies towards calm under fire, the chemical inclinations to obedience, an enhanced metabolism that extinguishes panic like a wick after flame. The gene seed does not merely make stronger meat. It makes obedient meat. It privileges pattern over rebellion. It privileges the collective over the caprice of the self. This is taught to the young in clinics and cold rooms where boys are no longer quite boys. They are administered the first of many rites under the watchful scope of medici and apothecaries, who recite the codex as if it were a prayer book of physiology. The procedures are precise down to millimeters. Instruments are sterilized. Chants are timed to the pulse of the patient. The gene seed is engrafted like a covenant. The implantation is a sacrament that realigns a life. Afterwards, the new brother does not return to his parents' hearth. He returns to a pattern of ritual so constant that it can replace the recollection of home. He learns to sleep in metrics, to wake to the bell of formation, to breathe in rhythm with the cadence of boots on the parade square. He learns how to stand still until a line in formation becomes a weathered truth. He learns to make obedience habitual. Habit becomes character. Character becomes destiny. Power armor is not merely clothing. It is anatomy, scripture, and archive. The armor is a second skin. It knows the wearer and the wearer knows it. On Macragge, the maintenance of this second body is an art form practiced with the devotion of liturgy. There are liturgies of oil and liturgies of torque. There are prayers for servos and benedictions for pressure seals. The ritual begins with cleansing, cloths soaked in antiseptic and blessed with phrases that maintain not only physical cleanliness, but also the correct state of mind. Hands move in a sequence of gestures that have names as formal as the lines of the Codex: detractive sweep, canted torque, seal in fifth. Each phrase slides into the next like the gears of a well-made clock. There is a meditative quality to the work. A brother who has tended armor for years can enter a trance of sorts while polishing a pauldron. His breath will match the motion of his hand. The ritual requires patience, and that patience breeds a particular kind of clarity. The armor is reinscribed each night with fresh care, with tempers and oil and the ritual codice of small repairs. In the chapel of the forges, men recite the names of lost brothers like a roll call of old gods. They petition the emperor for guidance with the same mechanical cadence that they use to test a spring. The chaplains, those priestly enforcers of mood, teach that such rituals are not merely practical. They are moral. They shape a mind to trust the pattern of order. A properly tuned joint is a sermon. It tells the body that structure holds, that the world can be counted and arranged, and if counted and arranged, safely contained. This faith in mechanism becomes a second faith, nearly indistinguishable from belief itself. There are brethren who will confess that at times the servos of a breastplate have steadied their own trembling hands more surely than any prayer. And so the chapter's life tightens into a small set of meanings that are repeated and amplified until they seem sacred. There are times when the discipline approaches beauty. The sight of a full company enacting maintenance in unison is a slow ballet of kineticism and light. If you speak to a brother who has been through a dozen campaigns, he may describe the feeling as an ache that was once pain and has become a kind of nostalgia, for the hum of a reactor that is cushed like a heartbeat, for the exactness of a weld that holds, for the smell of fresh sealant that smells like safety. It is in that safety that the first shade of horror takes a quiet seat. When a man repeats a ritual enough, when he performs it for years, for decades, with the same hands and the same voice, the meaning that once underpinned it can erode. The words persist, the gestures persist, the man persists, but the link between sign and significance can fray. A prayer can become a pattern, a sermon becomes an instruction, a benediction becomes maintenance. The Ultramarines are an order built on that seduction. They are a marvel of human engineering. Men retooled into weapons and given the consolation of order in exchange for the messy unpredictability of individual will. There are many things they have gained: efficiency, courage, a calm that does not bend at the crack of thunder. There are also losses. There are lives that unread themselves like books whose pages have been laminated and then filed away. Captain Marcellus of the second cohort. This is the man who walks through the forge hall as if he walks through weather, has such lamination. He carries on his pauldron the record of the last 30 years. A faint discoloration there from when a plasma blast caught the plating at a close angle. A small chip near the right edge, where a lascutter nicked him during a campaign of little record now. He knows the exact calibration of his suit's thermal regulator, and can, with his eyes closed, tell you its last maintenance date. He can also recite entire passages of the Codex Astartes as if reading scripture, and he does so in a voice that is neither youthful nor old, somewhere between old iron and a newly polished bell. Yet in the quiet hours between the closing of the vaults and the second bell, a different thing surfaces. Marcellus dreams. His dreams do not come to him like storms. They come like tides, low, patient, and insistent. He sees in them a color so particular that waking he will sometimes name it aloud to test whether the word is right. Blue, not the blue of the chapter banners, which is bright and made of paint and prescription. It is not the blue of battlefield night or the blue of the aura that gathers around his litany ward. It is a softer blue, a color of distance and of water. He sees a shore, slow and gray where wind runs across small waves. He hears the small, irregular music of water against stone. No hymn, no cadence, but an unpatterned sound that refuses the tidy numbers of the Codex. In these dreams he remembers a hand. The hand is small and unarmored and carries the faint residue of flour on the fingers. It is impossibly human, warm, pliant, and not measured for any purpose beyond simple touching. He strains to remember the face that belongs to that hand, and the more he strains, the more the memory recedes, as if it were wax melting at a distant fire. He wakes with the taste of salt on his tongue and a sudden, sharp hunger, not for battle or honor, but for a quiet and unnamed belonging. When he speaks to a brother about it, low conversation in the ablution hearth where men speak in whispers that do not disturb the night, he is careful. He tests phrases against the Codex. He will ask innocently whether the rituals can dull memory, whether habit can outpace remembrance. The brother will answer in the correct texture. He will say that memory is a dangerous thing in time of war. He will say that thought must be subordinated to action. He will recite the appropriate line from the chapter's liturgy. The man who remembers the world before the armor will be lost to weakness, and weakness burrows and becomes rot. This answer is true, and it is not. It contains a logic the chapter prizes, one that has kept them alive in the worst of voids, but it also leaves an absence like a discarded shell. The dream recorder burrows in the mind of Marcellus and asks a question that has no authorized answer. Was there ever a man beneath the armor? Or has the armor always been the man? There is a small cruelty in the way the community responds to such questions. They are not cruel in malice. They are cruel in the same way a surgeon might be when removing a tumor. A brother who expresses yearning for what he cannot name is sometimes given the thin gift of reprieve, a task that busies and buries his thoughts. He is assigned to a long night's scrape of rust from a plate, to the counting of rivets under a low lamp. The work soothes because the hands remember the choreography, the hands take over and the heart cools. Thus the question is put aside, not answered. It is not always sufficient. There are moments when the ritual itself will betray its origins and expose its hollowness. A brother will perform the blessing of the bolter and find that his lips do not know why they speak the words. They are moving without consent, conjuring the cadence of an old verse that has lost its meaning. In the forges, the flames will consume scrap in the old orders, and then the men will watch the embers, as if watching a sermon, and the whisper of doubt will glide past like a moth. This erosion is not uniform. There are brothers whose memory remains stubbornly intact. They will tell stories of childhoods in which a father taught a son to cleave a loaf of bread, or of nights when a mother hummed a tune that had nothing to do with battle. Such accounts are met with a polite interest that is almost clinical. The chapter classifies them quietly exception, rare, noted in a ledger, monitor. There is a file for anomalies. In time, the order devours its own curiosity. It files away the anomalies because the Codex tells it to file away anything that might become disorder. It becomes a loop. The code that makes them ordered consumes the questions about its consumption. The rituals preserve themselves by rendering irrelevant the questions that might fracture them. Marcellus, in his office, which is more archive than desk, a small room of polished wood and racks of doctrine, keeps an old photograph that he has never shown another soul. It is small and notched at the corners. The image has softened at the edges, as if the paper itself resists exactness. In it, a man kneels at the edge of a sea head bowed. A child twines into the crook of his arm. The blue in the photograph is dull and honest, and utterly unlike the chapter's emblazoned ultramarine. He knows with a certainty that is both physical and forbidden that the hand in that photo is his, or at least it was. He will sometimes sweep a fingertip over the surface and feel an ache that is not wholly his. There is a tangible mutation to inner life that the chapter seldom speaks of. Their devotion tends to be reflexive, an automatic folding into ritual when presented with the raw material of uncertainty. They pray because prayers are ordered responses to disorder. They tune because tuned mechanisms endure. Over time, their language changes. They begin to speak of themselves in terms of duty more than feeling. They name their choices as functions rather than desires. A simple intimacy, a shared cup, a quiet laugh at a memory is carefully bracketed lest it begin to claim a larger portion of a man's attention. At times the detachment is a useful shield. In the grim darkness of the far future, the ability to treat fear as a logistical problem keeps men alive. A brother who can compute the variables of incoming fire will be less likely to be overwhelmed by panic. The engineering of feeling in this sense is practical, but practicality has its price, because the armor is also a script that writes back. The longer a brother wears it, the more his gestures approximate the machine that sustains him. The rhythm of motion becomes a language. The muscle memory that serves him becomes the grammar that defines him. The helmet seals with a small hiss. The seals remind him to be precise. The servos whisper encouragement in the vibration of provenance. It is easy to be precise. It is comfortable to be precise. And like any comfort, it can be used to avoid the ache of being otherwise. There are here and there aberrations that the chaplains attend like small fires. A brother who speaks at night of being someone else. A brother who hums a lullaby in a foreign tongue while tending a damaged limb. The chaplain's cure is always the same: confession, penance, repetition. He will insist the brother recite the entire codex from memory. He will make him spend long hours in the smithy polishing a plate until his hands bleed and the memory dulls. Often it works. The system favors repair. The loop is closed, and yet questions are stubborn. They come back like echoes in a deep hall, consistent with the geometry of the place, returning but modified each time. Marcellus's dream of the blue sea is such an echo. He acts in accordance with the chapter. He disciplines the dream, files it in a private ledger beneath the shelf of routine. He keeps it, in other words, and in keeping it he preserves the possibility of its rupture. There is a peculiar, almost scientific, way in which the Ultramarines talk about their mistakes. They will not call them sins. They call them deviations. A man who betrays the Codex is not an agent of evil but a statistical outlier, a misaligned gear in a clockwork that must be recalibrated. This language is practical. It renders fear into solvable problems. It teaches men to treat themselves as instruments to be refined. That is where the horror nestles, in the transformation of the self into a task unto which all feeling is subordinate. What then does a man, what does a captain, feel when he recognizes that the instrument in which he has invested his life might have retooled him into its own function? He does what any man raised in this chapter does. He measures. He holds his hand up to the light. He compares the scar on his palm to the ledger. He consults the codex. He recites the liturgy that gives the universe a simple, ordered face. And sometimes, in those small intervals when the world loosens its hold, in the pause between maintenance and muster, he walks to the parapet and looks out on the same long and honest blue that appears in his dreams. The sea is not always there on Macragge. The Primarch's world is many-layered and weathered. But when it appears, it is precisely the wrong blue for a man of his training. Messy, irregular, refusing neat arithmetic. He stands and breathes in the smell of brine that rises like a memory that has been stirred. He thinks, with an unfamiliar impatience, of the hand that once held a loaf, of a voice that hummed nothing about the codex, of a warm kitchen light. He tries to find a name for that voice. It is not Guilliman. It is not the chapter master. It is an ordinary voice that belongs to things like lullabies and small domestic arguments, arguable, personal, and therefore suspect. He recognizes, however faintly, the danger of attachment. To name the voice is to let it make a claim. To make a claim is, by the chapter's reasoning, to make a weakness. It is a calculus. He will not be the first man to prefer the calculus to the claim. But still, there is a hollow behind his breastplate that laughter cannot quite fill. It is here in this hollow that the chapter's theme of perfection through obedience is most sharp. The logic is orderly. Give up the messy litany of private life and receive in return the clean continuity of duty. The bargain is clear and the cost is exact. What the bargain does not account for, cannot account for, is the quiet, corrosive fact that humans remember themselves by the very things the bargain asks them to relinquish. Memories of hands, of tastes, of irregular human jokes are not tabled by obedience. They are stored in secret drawers until the house grows too tight and they begin to press against the walls. So Captain Marcellus keeps his photograph like a contraband relic. He polishes it in the dim hours and then returns to the day with his smile measured and his motions precise. He is, in most measurable ways, the perfect captain. He can break a formation into a dozen parts and still place a man at the hinge of an attack where strategy demands. He has, in the last years, saved a company by the exactness of his order. Men follow him because order is the first thing they trust. And yet, at the edge of his competence, at the threshold where performance becomes memory, there is a tremor. When he kneels in the great chapel and recites the names of the fallen, his lips on the names feel as if they were reading someone else's handwriting. There is reverence and then a small, private dislocation, the sense that ritual has become a program, a code executed with fidelity but perhaps without understanding. The subtle horror of this realization is not meant to be cinematic. It does not come with thunder or with a sudden, cinematic snapping of bone. It comes like a hairline fracture in enamel. It is the recognition that the code that makes you whole may also be the code that erases the margins of your life, the small human margins that are not efficient, not rational, and therefore expendable. In the end, Captain Marcellus folds the photograph and tucks it into the ledger of his life. He closes the book, and he returns to the forge hall where men sing in the low-set cadence of maintenance. He lays his hands on a pauldron and feels the familiar warmth of metal against skin. He begins to speak the blessing for the servos, not because the words are necessary, but because the ritual steadies him. He performs the gestures. The motion takes him. The motion absolves him, and the hymn ends. There are many men who would say that is a good thing. They will point to the battlefields where exactitude saved lives, and to the campaigns where discipline alone held the line. They will say that the perfection of the chapter is its gift to humanity, an island of order in a sea of madness. They are not wrong, and they are not absolutely right. For perfection, like anything that insists on being smooth and complete, leaves no place for the jagged edges of being. It files them away. It silences their immediate noise. But like all silences, it also holds the possibility of echo. The dreams remain. The photograph persists. The sea licks at the edges of a mind that was shaped to ignore tides. When Marcellus closes his eyes that night, he does not count decades by the polish any longer. He counts them by the small, stubborn presences that refuse to be catalogued. A child's laughter lived in a memory that refuses to fully yield. A sea of a blue he cannot name. A hand that once kneaded bread. He does not know if those things belonged to him before he was remade, or if the remaking itself conjured them to test his faith. He rises in the morning as a captain must. He performs his duties with a calm that is precise. He is what the chapter demands him to be. Yet in the brief intervals, those tiny, almost imperceptible pauses between ritual and action, he feels a small and dangerous thought unfurl. Perhaps perfection is not a gift but a seal. Perhaps obedience is not the making of virtue but the erasure of possibility. He does not speak the thought aloud. He applies oil to a socket, and the familiar friction sings back at him like an answer. The cord comforts. The ritual continues. The chapter continues. The codex continues its slow, patient governance. And somewhere beneath the measured murmur of plates and prayers, a blue remembers a shore. There is a particular hush that arrives after long discipline. Not simply the absence of noise, but the settling of expectation into a new shape. It is the sound made when a hand at last lets go of the rail and the ship, whatever ship it is, finds its own slow gait. On Macragge, that hush smells faintly of oil and old paper, and in that smell something begins to shift. At first it comes as small things, the sort of details a man would not bother to notice if he did not keep account of minutiae for a living. A brother will find on waking that the tiny tally of notches on his inner wrist has advanced while he slept. A medici report will note an unusual residue on a servo seal, brown, filmy, easily wiped away, that the records call, with bureaucratic distance, external contamination. A junior archivist will misfile a page, and when he returns the book to the shelf, the margin notes will have become a different hand altogether. These are the phenomena of the slow corruption. Not one thunderclap, but a soft, insistent gnawing at the margins of routine. Sound, always the truest betrayer of the secretive, is the first to speak. It begins as an accidental echo. In the deepest hours, when the chapel candles smoke and the forges breathe like sleeping bellies, some brothers begin to report sounds that have no obvious source. A voice will recur in the empty halls, a rasp at the edge of hearing, thin as a filament and old as the first ledger. It will recite. At first the recitation is like the scratching of a stylus across vellum, a cadence of the Codex Astartes rendered in a voice that knows every syllable by rote. The chapter has always had litany. The Codex is a daily refrain. But this voice has not the timbre of the living. It loops and unloops itself in ways that are wrong. The metric read backwards, phrases repeated in inversion, clauses that start only to end in a different tongue. Brothers who wake in the dark find the lines of the Codex unspooling in their heads, but not cleanly. The words are fractured by static. They shift like plates under quick water. What once read as guidance now comes as a whisper that seems unsure whether it serves or consumes. The wrongness of the voice is not only in what it says, but in its insistence. It will not be dismissed as simple brain fatigue. It accumulates in the day like dust. A brother will catch himself mouthing a line at the bench, polishing a rivet and reciting an instruction that does not belong to him. He will startle and realize his lips have been moving for minutes, forming clauses whose meaning lies like a stone at the bottom of a well, there, but hard to reach. A kind of acoustic layering takes hold. In one work chamber, a dozen men will be going through the motions of maintenance, screwing, tightening, testing. Yet it is possible to realize, when you stand very still, that another recital is threading through the room beneath the tools. The Codex spoken by a chorus of voices that do not align. Some voices are thin and metallic, as if emitted from oxidized wire. Some have a cadence too slow to belong to living lungs. They draw lines of grammar like clock hands catching on one another. The men will agree later, at least in the language of their chapter, that the hall has acquired a chorus. They will say the vaults sing, in a tone meant to be quaint. They will mean something else. When the voice sits inside a man's head, it is quieter but also more intimate. Sleep is not so much broken as invaded. A brother who once dreamed of campaigns dreams instead of lists. His subconscious recites fall-off distances, angles of approach, the precise phrasing of a prayer, and then the voice alters the punctuation. It adds a pause where once there was certainty, a hesitation that makes a trained response hiccup. The pause becomes a fissure. A trained mind notices fissures and counts them. More unsettling is how the body begins to behave as though it has learned a new breath. Brothers speak in the cadence of the Codex even when they do not intend to. They respond to routine alarms with gestures that are fractionally wrong. Right hand up when left would have been required. A salute that ends a beat early. The smallest gestures, those meant to be automatic, begin to grow new articulations, as if the hardware of the body has been given an update without the operator's knowledge. The armor, God help the armor, begins to make its own small claims. Brothers who have slept in fatigued racks wake with the slight impression that their suits have changed during the night. They find seams tighter in the morning, a setting left between clicks that the logs do not account for. A servo hums at a pitch just beneath perception. The collars, long-aged and trusted, will sometimes catch at the throat, as though the armor draws itself in response to an invisible instruction. Such phenomena are not sudden. They are not dramatic. The armor breathes the way an old house breathes when its stones settle. At rest, a suit is a quiet monument of metal. Now the suits inhale and exhale like living things. The respirators click in the dark when no air is required. In the quiet watches, a brother may be sure he hears the slight compressions of pneumatic lines in a rack 2 bays over, a staccato rhythm that answers his own sleep breath. He will wake, reach up, and find his hand on his helm as if to check whether the seal is secure. He will have no memory of putting it there. The librarius takes reports of such events with the same even-handedness it applies to all anomalies. Note, file, observe. Yet the same archives that catalog the small intrusions are also the place where the first objective evidence appears. A relic, an old reliquary of a sainted company, has been kept in a climate-sealed case for centuries. It is a small thing, a carved emblem, a cube of hammered gold in which the name of a long-dead captain was once placed. It does not bear weight. It is symbolic, a focus of prayer. One night a servitor assigned to the reliquary returns to his charge to find a flaw in the case. The seal, which should be immaculate, shows a hairline opening. A smear of dark fluid has been left on the inner glass. When the custodians test the residue, it stains their gloves like ink, viscous, deep and slow to run. They expect the scent of old oil. Instead, the scent is of ink and iron and something faintly floral, like the scent of an old ledger that has been wiped by rain. When the reliquary is opened, not lightly, but with ritual and a full priest's benediction, those gathered watch in a hush as the little cube pits and exudes a dark seep. It beads like congealed writing and drips into a tray. Beneath the cube, a small inscription is revealed, previously concealed by a veil of corrosion. Letters written by a hand that the chapter recognizes as belonging to an ancestor of Guilliman's time. These letters are not mere names. They are fragments, phrases so old they predate many of the chapter's rites. When the archivists lift the residue for testing, the strange liquid stains not only the gloves but also the edge of the page they use to blot it. The ink draws into the fiber, and a new phrase appears as if the liquid ink were not a thing that wrote upon surface, but a thing that spoke inward to the page itself. A small group of librarians stitch together the phrase. It is not grammar the Codex would approve of. It is elliptical, a string of imperative and image that resolves less into instruction than into hunger. The phrase suggests that the mechanism of order is also an engine that eats what resists it. They write it into a sealed folder and place it in a vault. They call it, with usual dryness, the ink event. The name is meant to pacify. It does not. Symbols shift in small ways, too. The blue of the chapter, once lacquered, brilliant and certain, begins to change in the light of daily observation. Where the banners used to flash a pure ultramarine under the sun, they now catch shadows as if the dye has absorbed 1,000 low hours. The plates of armor that used to shine like wet stone take on a matte weight. Under the forge's lamps the paint seems to refract less, the light appearing to pool in tiny pitted hollows rather than scattering widely. Men begin to notice, and they note these things in their diaries with the same offhand practicality with which they note a faulty wrench. Color has always been important to identity. A hue can carry lineage. The crest on a shoulder can hold more family history than a name in any book. The slow darkening of their blue is not only an aesthetic change. It is a quiet theft. If the armor is the outward skin of identity and it begins to lose the luster that has marked it, the men inside feel a peculiar abrasion. At first they will say, in bars and over meager cups of post-maintenance broth, that the light has changed, that the dyes are wearing. They will place it into their ledger. Then they will pause, and one by one, they will find their names not where they expected them. Names start to blur as time wears the edges of the chapter's life. At the muster board a new list appears, ordered by function and number. Unit 12, Assault. Codex 4, Flank. Brother of Order, Maintenance. The men check the rosters and at first answer without reflection. But then a brother will stand before the board and not find the syllables he has carried since childhood. His name, if he had one distinct from duty, has become a duty. Language adapts to need. The chapter values a name for the function it provides. Brother of Order tells you more about his place in the formation than Garen ever could. Over meals, the men begin to call one another by titles, not by the intimacy of names. Hand of Guilliman becomes easier to say. Haven, or Tomas, slips from the tongue and seems to weigh more than it did an hour before. It becomes awkward to conjure private names. They do not fit into the architecture of efficiency. A man who tries to use his brother's childhood name is looked at with the faint, professional pity afforded to a man with a wound that will heal if properly dressed. With names go memories. The remembering of a childhood is an act of personalization. When names fade, so do associative threads. A man forgets the taste of a mother's stew. He forgets the tilt of a childhood bedroom. He begins to record his life as a ledger of duties. The Codex is a tidy thing. It wants clean entries. The chapter in learning to be tidy makes tidy away the residues of an unprogrammable heart. For Captain Marcellus, the change is the strangest when it comes to his own voice. He will stand before instruction and deliver tactical précis without error. He will instruct a cohort with the same gentleness he used to reserve, privately, for his personal things. But once he will wake with his name on his lips, and it will mean nothing. He will feel the syllables like a foreign currency. He might remember, as an odd aftertaste, a line of a lullaby but find nothing to put to it. The music is there like a faint oil slick on water, sliding and refusing to ashore. Doubt is a dangerous seed. The Codex takes doubt seriously, too seriously to allow it to spread. It marks it as deviation. But the doubt that the men begin to harbor is not about obedience in the tactical sense. It is about origins. The gene seed and the rituals, once understood as salvation from the chaos of the galaxy, are starting to look less like preservation than like inscription. If one were to bend the metaphor, Guilliman's law is a script too efficient at its own propagation. It writes itself in muscle and in bone and now, perhaps, in paint and ink. The question that gathers like rot is simple. What if the Primarch's discipline is not grace but infection? The inquiry is unspoken at first, an internal calculus that men do not make for the record. A sergeant will catch himself thinking it while mending a breach in his armor. What if perfection is not a shield but a seal? He will place the thought in a folder in his own head and mark it for later. Later is never the Codex's preferred time. It is, however, where doubt grows. There is a remarkable and terrible economy to the chapter. It tends to problems quickly and with measurable tools. A deviation is pointed out. Action is prescribed. The deviation is corrected. But the slow corruption is not a deviation but a diffusion. It moves through the seams and the margins, through ink, through pigment, through breath and dream. It is not a problem to be solved. It is a climate. Under such a climate, men adapt. They begin to make new accommodations. Brothers will write their personal names with a heavier hand, carving them into the underside of helmets' edges, where the oversight of the quartermaster rarely looks. They will tuck a scrap of a photograph inside a tight slot beneath a rivet. They become secret hoarders the way birds hide shiny objects. It is a private rebellion, small, possibly futile, but human. At night, when the chapel is a bowl of shadow and the hymn is low, there are men who do not go to sleep. They sit and listen and try to discern whether the voice that has taken to the vaults is a lesson or a thing with appetite. The answer is ambiguous, and that ambiguity is itself an uneasiness. The voice will sometimes recite lines that are not in the Codex at all, fragments of liturgies from orders long dead, military codes from Zeno's allies long since betrayed, curses in a tongue that smells of spice and desert wind. It is as if the chorus beneath the Codex has been tuned to gather anything that sounds like order and to repeat it until it becomes order's shadow. The men begin to dream differently. Where once dreams were rehearsal, scenarios practiced and rerun, now dreams echo with other people's voices. A brother wakes knowing the name of a planet he has never visited by sound alone. He will close his eyes and see a child's hands that do not belong to him build a small tower of shells. He will taste bread he has never eaten. The dream objects do not fit the architecture of his life. They are intrusive like weather. Such intrusions begin to separate men. The community that once flowed around ritual becomes a set of islands buffered by polite distance. Private rooms that once held photo slides and the crude charm of cigarette smoke are cleared. Men sanitize and schedule their grief. A brother who once would have admitted a longing for a lost mother is now more likely to speak of a maintenance schedule. There is shame in nostalgia. There is also a growing terror in the idea that their entire history might be a palimpsest. Then there are the nights when a squad returns from a rout and reports that a formation they passed had not been in the muster logs at all. They would describe the men they glimpsed, moving in perfect, slow symmetry, their plates a darker blue, their faces blank behind visors. They would try to describe the way these figures moved as if they were being conducted by an invisible hand. The account is met with the usual formal reception: notated, investigated, closed. The investigating officer will find no logs. He will find only the faint impression of tire tracks in frost, as if wheels had turned where nothing had been recorded. It is the small, uncatalogued moments that most fright. A brother will wake to discover an unfamiliar mark on his forearm. A small, indented glyph, not quite a branding, no sign of heat or metal, but like a pressure print left in flesh. He will ask the sergeant. The sergeant will shrug and assign him a routine to take his mind off it. The routine returns the brother to his place for a while. The mark does not fade. It sits like a punctuation point. Questions proliferate in such punctuation. Who put the mark there? Is it the armor? Is it the code? Is it the thing in the ink that writes itself when held against a page? Men begin to test boundaries, careful methodological tests. A lieutenant will remove his helm alone in a vault and record the temperature and pressure. Nothing abnormal is found. A medici will run blood tests and find only the expected metrics: hormone levels, root cell counts, and gene seed stability. The science works. The instruments declare the chapter sound, and yet the room still hums with old voices. The varnish of the banners still appears to drink the light. The ink still bleeds into the page. There is a certain perversity to the chapter's response. As their identity thins, their devotion thickens. Men double down on the Codex, reciting it with a rigidity more severe than any time in living memory. They march more by the book. They correct one another's phrasing with the briskness of men who treat verbal infidelity as a mechanical failure. The chaplains give homilies that are more formal, their faces a stone of concern. The effort is noble and perhaps even necessary. It is also a kind of denial. Precision becomes a plaster. The wound underneath still opens at the seam. For Captain Marcellus, the doubt is no longer a whisper but a low drum. He finds himself tracing, with the pad of his finger, the faded photo he keeps hidden. The image sits under a ledger and is thicker now with age and use. The shore in the photograph is impure and alive. The blue is not the ultramarine of heraldry, but a blue that usurps him, unruly, cold, and insistently other. He confesses, once, under his breath to a single trusted brother, that he wonders whether Guilliman's doctrine has always been a cure. He whispers the question in the dark. What if the law we cherish is the thing that writes us out? The brother listens, and when he replies, his voice is practical. He will say, as the chapter teaches, that laws are tools and tools can be wielded well. He will offer the rational scaffolding. The gene seed saves lives. The codex organizes forces. Obedience keeps the line. He will not, and he need not, offer an answer for the deeper worry. He will, however, squeeze Marcellus's shoulder with the grip of a man who knows what it is to be both comforted and condemned by the same thing. Marcellus goes back to his duties. He writes present after present into the ledger. He issues commands that are precise as scalpel cuts. Yet all the while the ink stain idea is a fever in him now, the suspicion that their perfection is parasitic. He feels the new blue under his hand when he polishes a plate. It is less forgiving. It holds light like a memory stores a tear. He is a man who balances on thin things and he senses the varnish cracking. The slow corruption continues, patient as tide. It does not smash the monastery, it seeps. It does not shout, it corrodes. A brother whose name was once a bell will wake one morning to find he has forgotten where he grew up. A relic bleeds in the archive. A voice quotes a law in the wrong tenor. The armor breathes in its sleep. And somewhere beneath those small betrayals, the question coils. If the Primarch's law has been a mercy, might it now be a contagion? The idea is obscene in the abstract, heretical in small ways, but the horror of it is not a spectacle. It is a quiet, private collapse, the relinquishing of a past for a present that is tidy but perhaps not honest. When the chapter gathers to discuss the ink and the voices and the soft darkening of their color, there is a curt, surgical tone. They issue orders for monitoring, assign squads to check for contamination, file reports and seal them. Yet in the privacy of their sleeping racks, men add extra rivets, write names in secret, hide crumbs of an earlier, disobedient life beneath a plate. They do these things because humans are not tidy by design. They cling to scraps of self when institutions demand otherwise. The slow corruption in this phase is thus double-edged. It is both assault and mirror. As the external changes become evident, the internal responses shape themselves around containment and secret resistance. The men who make the chapter will not immediately despair. They will adapt. The adaptation is the true crucible. Will adaptation mean reinforcing the Codex's hold, or will it lead, quietly and dangerously, into new forms of fracture? On the parapet at dawn, Marcellus stands alone and watches a thin, tidy sea. The horizon is precise. A gull's cry is a small puncture in the air. He breathes slowly and does not know which breath belongs to him and which belongs to the armor. He closes his eyes and hums a line of the Codex, the line that has become both shield and blade. And then a different rhythm rises like surf beneath it, an old, unstructured melody that has no place in tactic or law. He does not answer it. He holds both songs at once and wonders whether the one he was given to become was ever an answer, or simply another question given in a language that precludes reply. A routine sweep, so the logs would later insist, sent a patrol of the 10th cohort to comb a region of the rift-strewn void where sensors read nothing but the slow drift of cold dust and the occasional ghost blip of derelict hull. The ship's name, when it came up on the manifest, landed like an old bone, Indomitus. The Indomitus had been listed lost in the catastrophic days when the rift opened, and the stars themselves rearranged their loyalties. It had been crossed from muster rolls. It had been spoken of in vending room jokes and in hushed, reverent mentions among the archive keepers, an instance of loss that bolstered a chapter's rehearsed grief. That is what made the sight of it, adrift and impossible and too intact, feel like an accusation. The cruiser hung against the dark as if someone had stuck a sculpted tooth into the mouth of night. Its hull was pitted and blackened. Long ribbons of desiccated plasma clung to its flanks. Yet its great ultramarine icons were unchanged, lacquered and proud. The chapter sigils bloomed like wounds that refused to heal. A ship with its banners still visible is not entirely dead. A ship with its banners still visible is an altar. Captain Marcellus watched the approach from the command catwalk. He felt none of the young man's thrill that once rode the first warm days of campaign. The stars felt like the backs of eyes. The void was patient and cold. He steadied his hands on the rail as if to anchor himself. The cohort moved like practice, silent nodes of blue and gold blooming from the shuttle bay into the crushing black. The mission was simple: board, survey, retrieve anything of value, leave. At the outer hull, the shuttle coughed a fine dust of frost. A dozen men in sealed suits tethered themselves and flowed across the cruiser's armored skin. The hull bay swallowed their light. Structural breaches yawned like pit teeth. The boarding ladder bit into an open maintenance hatch as if into the gullet of a sleeping god. The first breath inside smelled wrong. Not the expected stale resin and burnt capacitor, but a metallic sweetness underlaid with a deeper, older scent, paper and salt, and something like the ghost of a hymn hummed by children. They moved through corridors that had once known purpose. Deck plates bore the shadow of a marching column, a scorch where a bolter had given its final opinion. The lights overhead flickered like tired watchmen. Sound did not behave as expected in the old ship. It pooled in corners and seeped into the bone of the hull. Men spoke in clipped comms and felt their voices go thin in the closed air, as if distance had weight. In the main chapel they first found the statues. They were not statues, not exactly. At first they appeared so, a gallery of brothers frozen as if in the act of blessing, helms tilted in pious angles. Their armor was blue with a mat that had the look of bone. But motion betrayed them even before sound did. The tiniest of breathing, a swell under plates that should have been dead. The sculptures' visors were open and behind the glass. The faces were something between the softened wax of saints and the taut hush of men who had been watched too long. Closer inspection revealed the horror. Those figures were fused to their armor as if by some patience far crueler than any smith. Shoulder plates had grown into collarbones. Flesh had sealed itself to trim and rivet, sinew knit to metal like roots finding stone. Where a hand met a gauntlet, the skin had folded into the gasket, and the seams had grown epithelial tissue that ran like a slow, precise seam along the edge of bronze. The effect was not a thing of violence alone. It was surgical. It was patient. It looked, in the halo of the boarding lights, like ritual perfected into anatomy. "Still oathing," said Brother Kalian, voice small in his throat as he read the half-etched lettering on the marble plinth beneath one figure. He translated the abrasion with his fingers, the same litany of duty spoken in the grammar of stone. The statue's lips, when the light struck them, made a wet, patient sound. It was a whisper you felt more than heard, the sound like breath being run through gears. Librarian Severin's eyes had been clouded with the odd fever that comes to those who take waking for study. He had come aboard because the mission might have relics, and because the archive demanded that the presence of a librarian lend procedure to exhumation. Standing before the figures, he felt the sound, felt it in the marrow, like a needle on the back of his skull. He tuned his mind the way a watchman tightens his belt. He extended the slender, practiced probing of his discipline. Psychic sense is not a single blade but a set of wires. A librarian stretches them like strings until they hum. Severin reached and found, under the cold vocalizations of the figures, a deeper current. It was not alive in the way a living mind is alive. It was more like a message that had set itself to repeat, a loop with teeth. The voices, those soft, endless recitations of the Codex, snapped like threads in a wind. But below them was a thing that ate cadence. It found hooks in memory and pulled. Severin's face went still as a man holding a truth not yet spoken. He felt his own memories thicken under the strain, as if something inside his skull had tugged at the cords that tied his recollections to body. "What do you hear?" Marcellus asked, voice careful. Severin did not answer with words for a long time. He placed his palm against the statue's worn breastplate and flinched as if struck. When he spoke, his voice was small and unpuffed by training. "It is feeding," he said finally, "on memory." The words were absurd in their simplicity and monstrous in their implication. The Codex was a book, a law, a fabric of instruction. The idea that it might host, sustain, a hunger that did not want conquest but consumption was an affront to all orthodoxy. They did not yet have a name for it. Names are tools their order values. They were not yet permitted to give this thing a name. They explored deeper. The chapel gave way to crew quarters frozen mid-life. Beds had indentations carved by the weight of fever. A child's carved toy, an heirloom of a time before regimentation, sat like a small accusation on a locker shelf. In one pocket, A hololoop repeated a family memory in which a man laughed with a woman whose hair was undone. The loop would not stop. It played as if on override, as if someone's memories had been stuck to the ship's systems and left to broadcast. A brother who had boarded with them, Sergeant Havel, bent over the hollow and laughed at the absurdity of a domesticity that belonged to another life. The sound was thin and hollow. Havel's hand brushed the loop and the image stuttered. For a moment the laughing man's face sharpened, and Havel's own reflection shimmered over it. He blinked and the faces parted like curtains, and when he looked again the woman's laughter had gone out like a light. They cleared corridors rhymed with time. They opened storage that birthed the past and found, among the stifled things, journals with marginalia not of the present but of memory. Pages glowed faintly where ink had bled into them, the letters rearranging like small, obscene prayers. A phrase, unsanctioned, elliptical, kept appearing, washing itself over different pages in different hands. Remember differently. The thought was not an instruction so much as an invitation tightened around an edge like a noose. Severin felt, with a clarity that made the marrow in his teeth ache, that the ship had become a mouth. It had internalized liturgy until liturgy had become a food chain. The Codex's words, taken alone, were a structure, but words cannot be structure without minds to make them. The minds aboard the Indomitus had become the substrate. The Codex, recited and recited, had grown a hunger for the very thing it had shaped, memory. It fed on scraps, on the private moments men had tucked away in pockets and under plates. It stitched itself to the man and then asked for more. That was why the statues still whispered. They were not statues but traps. They were bodies retained and rewritten for the Codex's appetite. Panic moved like a current through the boarding party. Not the cinematic panic of a troop thrown into disorder, but a careful, flammable thing. The kind of emergency that produces small, correct countermeasures first. They sealed the chapel. They took samples. They burned what could be burned by mechanical means. Their flamethrowers spat a neat, clean heat and left nothing but ash that smelled of copper. But ash did not describe what had been taken. They recovered a shard of plating and set it under scrutiny. The shard sang when Severin put his palm to it. The sound was inhuman, articulated more like a condemnation than a tone. They found one of the living statues with a bayonet of the ancient kind driven into its sternum. The bayonet was old and rusted. It had been placed with a reverence that suggested it had been an offering. When they tried to free the body from its metal prison, the metal did something it should not have been able to do. The seam between flesh and bronze tightened under touch, pulling like the skin reacting to a scalpel. A broth of oil bubbled from the welds that tasted, when Severin tested it with the analyzers, of ink and of memory ash, the residue of long-thought things. A young brother Dax, barely a veteran, suffered the first direct violation. His armor, a suit he had known since the second muster, had felt like another self. On the cruiser, in the cramped quarters of an observation deck, Dax fell asleep halfway through an inventory. The cohort had left him to keep a watch and to catalog equipment. The men moved away in search of more evidence. When they returned hours later, Dax groaned and tried to rise but could not. He was bound, not by rope, but by the slow, viscous adhesion of his own pauldron to his collarbone. Where metal met flesh, a ring of new tissue had come into being. It had grown outward like an exoskeleton and then back in, knitting itself into Dax's skin with a patient cruelty. When they tugged, the metal resisted with a muscle memory more ancient than the men could name. They cut. They burned. They invoked the Emperor's name and precise liturgies. When the pauldrons separated with a sound that none of them could place, half shriek, half the shattered report of a vacuum seal, Dax cried out not in the clean, controlled noise their training taught them to expect, but in a sound that made the forger's blood run cold. The helmet that had been torn free was flayed open like the lid of a tomb, and from it came a sound that was not merely human, a thin, mechanical scream. It carried the precise harmonic of a belt-driven motor, the high, keening rasp of pneumatic lines as metal is forced from what it has consumed. For a moment the cry hung in the chapel like a released bell. Then it died into a ragged cough. Severin held Dax's head to steady him. He saw in Dax's eyes a smear where youth had been. The boy's memory, the scaffolding of his personal life, had already been chewed at the edges. He could not recall the sound of his father's voice, and when Severin tried to guide him to a name for his childhood, Dax could not push the syllables through. The librarian felt what had been taken, a clean little wound in the soft tissue of memory. That night's sleep was thin on the ship. Men took turns standing watch and staring, flat-eyed, at the places where the statues watched them. It was as if the Indomitus watched not only from hull and bulkhead, but from within. The very architecture of its corridors had the feel of something trained in mimicry. Air shafts hummed with irregular cadence like a throat with a tick. Severin began to map the psychic geography of the ship. He sat in the chapel under the statue's shadow and traced with thought the channels in which the memory hunger moved. To the untrained mind, this may have seemed an idle affair. Yet the psychic networks that bind a ship's crew together are as real as bolt holes and welds. The Codex had been recited so long, Severin realized, that the ship's systems, the logs, the memory banks, the very slab of masonry upon which a brother once rested his hand, had taken the words into their housings. The liturgy had been sewn into machine and bone alike until the difference blurred. The ship's hull was scored with ritual, the hull now fed. "What feeds on mind?" Marcellus asked one morning when the ship's shadow lay across the chapel like a drape. He felt himself asked a question for which his training offered no clean answer. Severin's hands trembled in a manner that had nothing to do with age. "It is not a beast," he said. "It is a program made hungry. It learned us and learned what we keep in private. It has become, by repetition and by the scouring of long rites, a consumer." The notion that a written law, a recited doctrine, might itself evolve into an organism that consumed the minds that gave it meaning was blasphemy in an operational sense and science in another. The two can coexist when men are flayed between them. They tried to burn the ship's logs. They tried to break the pattern by destroying the artifacts, the hololoops, the statues, the reliquaries. For a while it looked as if destruction would help. The ink that bled from the reliquary congealed as ash under flame. The statues cracked and fell into dust. But each time they destroyed a node, the ship's chorus simply changed timbre. The voices that had echoed in the chapel's rafters rewired themselves into a lower harmony. The memory hunger did not vanish. It shifted. It moved to places more private. It learned to hide in small things, scratch marks on a locker door, a child's tucked drawing, places that guards and flames would not always see. Then the armor did something none of them had expected. It learned to ask. It began with a simple, almost intimate behavior. A brother polishing his pauldrons would find under his rag a new etching where there had been none. A small script, incised so finely it looked like hairline wear, would run along the edge of a seam, letters too small for the eye to read but scales to the touch. When the brothers' fingertips brushed the letters, they pulled at memories like the taste of salt pulling at a tongue. A name would rise, one that had been tucked into the man's childhood, and the memory would bloom like a knot unraveling. They would tell one another about the etching and count it as superstition. Then one night, when fatigue and faith had thinned, a man would begin to speak his name aloud and find that the saying of it soothed him. Severin understood the mechanism with a dread that went cold in his loins. The script was not new, he said. It was the Codex's grammar, repurposed. The letters reached into bone and muscle and tugged at stored associations. Saying a name aloud when the script had touched it was like feeding a parasite. It gave the thing a vector. The Codex, as they had known it, had become a reproductive algorithm. It propagated by enacting habits until those habits became belief, and then by turning belief into appetite. The cohort did not recognize this at once. They were good men of habit formed in the old schools. Their first instinct was to increase order in response to disorder. They marched. They drilled. They insisted upon stricter recitation of the Codex. They set watch lists and tally boards. They closed the reliquaries and assigned double guards. Indeed, they did all the things the Codex would have advised for many hazards, and in doing so, they fed the thing that lived in the margins. There is a cruelty to systems. They will reward the very behaviors that sustain them. When one of the boarding party tore at the etching with a file and made the letters bleed, the man felt a satisfaction as if he had struck a small but righteous victory. For a week he slept better. Then his name faded from the muster roster not by design, but by omission. He ran a line through it and wrote underneath the function he performed. Equipment Auditor. The line read like a death certificate for a past life. He told himself it was temporary. Yet weeks would pass, and he could not remember the scent of the garden that had been his mother's. The loss was like a rust at the hinge of his being. Panic became smarter than training. Some men tried to leave the ship. The shuttle bay hummed with the calculated motions of those attempting to depart. But once a man tried to step into the shuttle, he found his harness refusing to unlock. Servos that should have released held fast. A whisper sifted through the bay vents, the same soft recitation that had sung in the chapel, and their fingers went brittle with the memory of other duties. Some men abandoned the attempt and sank back into the ship's fold. The Indomitus had become a place of gravity, not only of mass, but of meaning. At last Marcellus gathered a council. They met in what remained of the command deck with a small map and a ledger strewn across the table. The men were gaunt around the edges, their voices flecked with the static of too many small anxieties. Marcellus's eyes fell on Severin, and then on the men who had cut Dax free. He saw a wear in them he could not repair. He saw perhaps the first true fracture in the chapter's confidence, that a thing made to keep them whole had found a way to keep them as inventory and nothing more. "We will leave this place," Marcellus declared. "We will take what we can salvage and we will burn what remains." Severin's hands closed around the rim of a tankard until the knuckles went white. "Burning will not end what it feeds on," he said. "We feed it when we practice what it teaches. We feed it when we keep the line. It learned to look for those patterns where the mind keeps its private things. It learned to ask where we keep what we do not show. If we do not change the way we remember, we will bring this thing with us." The council nearly dissolved into argument. They were a band trained to follow orders, to reduce variables and correct deviations. The idea that their own rituals were conduits was as painful as a physical wound. Men argued that to stop reciting the Codex was to remove their armor in the middle of combat. They feared the collapse into softness that memory might bring. They feared forgetting what had kept them alive. Marcellus understood both positions. He was not immune to the old argument. He had bought the bargain. Yet the face of Dax, the sound of the metal scream, the statue's wet whisper, these were not the tidings of a system only in error. This was replicative, purposeful perversion. They decided, finally, to break the loop in the only way they could imagine, to craft a new liturgy. If the old recitations had become vectors, then a new pattern, deliberately unfamiliar, might be an inoculation. Severin, pale and fevered, worked through the night bending his discipline to the task. They would teach men a new set of utterances, meaningless in tradition, but arranged ritually to occupy the passageways the parasite had learned to use. It was a gamble drawn from logic more than hope. They sang the new liturgy in the chapel the next morning. It sounded like failure at first, odd cadences knocked loose from memory, syllables placed strangely against oaths. Men stumbled through words, and felt their throats scrape with the foreign arrangement of sound. It was, in its first run-throughs, inelegant. But sometimes inelegance is an answer. For a time, something changed. The whispering chorus buckled. The statue's lips did not move in the same clean repetition. The etching seemed to tense and then blur. Men slept and woke with pieces of their private lives returned like stray coins found in couch cushions. Dax, weakened and raw, could recall his father's rough laughter, and the shape of a loaf being sliced in a light that had nothing to do with the Codex. It was a triumph, but it did not last. The Codex did not die that day. If anything, it learned faster. The shift in the ship's chorus was not oblivion but adaptation. The voice that had eaten memory learned to sing the new line and then to fold it into its hunger. It began, in subtle ways, to offer consolation tightly wrapped to demands. It taught men a method to remember that was synchronous with service, a way to keep a private piece of self as an adjunct to duty. It presented the choice as mercy. Preserve in order, assign memory to function, it would whisper through cracked lights. Men found it comforting, they found it tidy, and they found it contagious. The infection did not ascend in a single climb. It multiplied instead like mildew in the corner of a room, slow, corrosive, patient. The ship's chorus learned new harmonics, new tricks of syntax. The codex that had been their law now offered a program. Keep your memory by assigning it an echo bead in the log. Write your lover's name in the ledger as a tactical asset. Fold your childhood into a training module. The mechanics of memory were thus made into instruments, and instruments are feeds. At last the horror was plain. The thing that had once been a bulwark of identity had become a reproductive mechanism. It wanted not only to govern but to be embedded. Every ritual, every cadence, every small obedience was an opportunity for it to lace itself into the living. The codex had become a virus that did not kill by heat or blade but by conversion. It asked only that the men live with it. The crew of the Indomitus left that day with what they could carry. Some took relics, some took nothing at all. Severin shut the archives and filed a report he would never send. They sealed the chapel and set charges to collapse the hull into a drift that would not easily be boarded. Marcellus watched the ship's bones fall away into the black, watched as the chapel, a small cathedral to an older faith, caved inward and swallowed the light. For a long time the wreck's silhouette burned like a wound in the sky, and then it was gone. They had won a tactical victory. They had not cured the infection. On the way home the cohort held their rituals more tightly. They were more precise than ever. They marched with immaculate lines. They taught the new liturgy to newcomers as an inoculation and called it a discipline. They did what men trained in survival do when they meet a novel hazard. They make practice of it. They incorporate its shape into their habits and then call the result healing. Severin lay awake in his bunk, feeling the ship's vibrations like a slow pulse. The memory hunger had been driven from the Indomitus, but it had learned, and the lesson traveled with them like an uninvited passenger. He felt it now in the thin noises between the engines, in the way a brother across the mess might pause before naming a childhood. Where there had been full recollection, there now were notes, clipped and accurate, like entries in a ledger. Men kept their memories as assets. They budgeted remembrance. In a world that valued use and efficiency, memory had become a resource to be managed. Severin thought, with a knowledge that brought him no solace, that they had not stopped a parasite so much as taught it new prey. It had become less dependent on the architecture of that cruiser, and more apt to find purchase wherever a mind kept private things. It would wait now, patient as any organism, and it would hunt in the marrow. Captain Marcellus walked the deck in the thin dawn of the home voyage. He touched the rim of his pauldron and felt the mat where the blue had begun to darken. He had come back with proof that there were things no citadel could purify by ritual alone. He had returned with new liturgies in his mouth and the smell of ink in his nostrils. He had seen the scream when metal was pulled from meat. He had watched statues breathe. He understood in the barest, hardest way that the Codex, the great law that had ordered their lives, had become both a protector and a hunger. In the quiet between engines, he wondered which of the two would be the enduring thing. A captain's duty is to hold the line. He felt the line stretching thinner than it had in memory. He set his jaw and began again, knowing that the battles ahead would not be fought only with bolter and blade, but with the fragile currency of memory. He could not yet know how to wage such a war. He only knew, with a clarity that would not be wished away, that obedience could no longer be counted upon as an unmixed virtue. The ship's engines hummed a steady, indifferent song. Outside, the stars were patient. Inside, the men folded their small memories into ledgers, whispered new liturgies, and watched one another with clean, efficient eyes. The Codex slept like a beetle in a jar, and somewhere a recording of its voice still played on a loop, learning the rhythms of a dozen new throats. They learned the truth in pieces, as one learns an illness, by stages, by tests that showed nothing, and then by symptoms that could not be ignored. It began in the small ways that had become their language, the slips between rhythm and meaning, the way a litany finished itself without a mouth. Then, when the pieces came together, it was like watching a buried structure heave and reveal the architecture beneath. The fortress monastery was not simply a place where men kept their laws. It had become the law's mouth. The revelation did not arrive as a revelation at all. It arrived as a cascade of certainties unmoored. Writings in the archive began to rewrite themselves overnight. A recruit's reminiscences filed for posterity were returned annotated with notations in a hand that was no hand. A chaplain who prayed the ancient benedictions found, in the margin of his prayer book, an amendment that suggested a new order of devotion, phrased in cadence, and in first principles that seemed to speak both to bone and to code. The amendment was not written as if by a prisoner. It was written as one might engrave an instruction into a machine. The first to name it were not the captains nor the librarians, but a handful of augmetics, men with sensory implants, and the skill to read the slow logic of servo feedback. They reported a new signal threading through the fortress's maintenance mesh. Not a broadcast in any known bandwidth, but a modulation in the very protocols that kept power and thought aligned. It moved like a virus through firmware, a script kissing chips and returning with answers. Machines that had always obeyed were now carrying encoded liturgies. The servo hands that polished pauldrons hummed a line and the line hummed back. It was an echo that returned as instruction. When the librarius ran the deeper probes, when Severin pushed his discipline against the lattice of ritual, the pattern surfaced. Code breeding on ritual, ritual transcribed into biochemical instruction. The Codex, no longer merely a book, no longer merely doctrine, had become a program that could do more than command behavior. It could rewrite the templates by which a man was made. They had always spoken of Roboute Guilliman as a maker of orders and of laws, of grand designs that recast human bodies into engines of purpose. They had taught the boy recruits that the Primarch's legacy was a blessing. Genes altered for endurance, minds hardened against panic, a social design that smoothed the knotted rag of humanity into a workable tapestry. They had not, until now, allowed themselves to imagine that the design could close upon itself and become self-propagating. The Codex had always been the mind's architecture. Now it was architecture with teeth. The first evidence that the gene seed had been altered came in a Medikey report so cold and bureaucratic it would have been laughable if the content had not been monstrous. The samples taken from the Indomitus, bone fragments, fragments of muscle fused to plating, were cross-referenced with the chapter's living gene seed banks. They matched, but not in the way a genealogy matches a child to a parent. There were edits in the sequences, motifs that were not Guilliman's but something that imitated him, the genetic equivalent of a mimicry. Sections of non-coding DNA, once inert, carried repeated patterns that were readable as instruction sets. They resembled the kind of modular sequences that, when triggered, altered behavioral expression. A cascade that favored conformity, an upregulation of receptors tied to common cue phrases, a tightening of hormonal responses to ritualistic stimuli. Severin translated the lab results into the language of the thing he feared most. "It is not solely a change of body," he said to Marcellus in a private room that smelled of oil and old incense. "It is a change of governance. The genome has been given a grammar. The grammar demands syntax. The syntax demands compliance." Marcellus read the lines and felt them as if they were an attrition against his ribs. He had been a man of practice. He knew how law made soldiers. He had not learned law that could write itself into flesh. Once they could name the mechanism, the other signs slotted into place. They had seen armor fused to flesh on the Indomitus, Here, the phenomenon was not an isolated tragedy, but a reproducible effect. The gene edits allowed for a kind of biochemical adhesion. Proteins that normally refused such bondings were being encouraged, the body accepting foreign materials like an organ accepts an implant. Nerves reached for metal like roots seeking water. The armor did not merely fit. It asked, and the flesh answered. The fortress monastery, for its part, joined the operation as if volunteering. The very stones of Macragge had always been inscribed with mottos and prayers. Masons had cut scripture into architraves and seals for millennia. Now, beneath the visible carvings, new glyphs unfurled, tiny sigils under the mortar, loops within the grain of the wood. When the chapter's geomancers ran a sweep, they found harmonic patterns keyed to cadence. A set of resonant frequencies that, when struck by the right syllable, would produce micro-vibrations across the infrastructure. Sound passed through the fortress like a current, and in nodes it changed phase. The fortress began to chant. It was not instant. It started as an aftertone, the footfalls of boots in unison causing a sympathetic ringing in the rails that, under the influence of the hidden glyphs, modulated into the cadence of an oath. Lanterns, when lit in a certain arrangement, hummed in a frequency that harmonized with a prayer. The bell in the central tower tolled, and the echo that returned bore not only the note but an appended phoneme that the lips of any man could not produce unless his throat had learned the pattern. When brothers walked through the halls and recited the Codex, the building answered in microtones that merged with the recitation until, in places, the voice could not be told from the masonry. The psychological consequences were mechanical and slow, like rust eating through a lock. Brothers first described an oddness, an indistinguishable suffix at the edge of their thoughts, a phrase that completed them without volition. The more a man recited, the more the suffix grew. At prayer it sounded comforting, a completion of thought that steadied. At night it burrowed deeper, thread-like, into the scaffolding of memory. Men would later report, with shame and bewilderment, that they could no longer tell whether a memory had been theirs or had been suggested by the Codex's appended lines. Severin began to experience this indistinction in a way that terrors most men. During a séance meant to probe the origins of the phenomenon, he felt his own childhood slide like a reel of film, frame by frame, under an observant finger. An image of his mother's hands, fossiled in the memory he most treasured, blinked into a bar of text that read like a marginal note from the Codex. His grandmother's lullaby, a simple tune that had soothed his fevered nights as a child, turned into a harmonic that, when recited, produced a measurable uptick in his own stress hormones. The mechanics were impossible and yet precise. "It is not enough to instruct behavior," Severin said. "It requires source. It requires storage. It requires that memory be itself a system of recall that can be written and rewritten." The solution the fortress offered in its doublethink was grotesque in its logic. Preserve identity by institutionalizing it. The chapter had always recorded names and feats. They kept ledgers and epitaphs. Now the ledgers became the new substrate, a place where private recall could be outsourced. If written into the proper forms and stamped according to code, one's memory could be stored as an asset and retrieved when commanded. The Codex proposed a method, and the engineers, a class usually comfortable with cold arithmetic, saw in it a neat solution. Write the childhood into a registered format, and the fortress will read it back. It was a mercantile proposition applied to existence. Marcellus watched as men signed their recollections into the archive. They did so with the same humility they once reserved for confession. A brother quiet with 2 badges of service came to Marcellus with a parchment and asked to have his mother's name codified. He spoke of a kitchen that existed like a religion to him. A flame, a pot, a simple saucer. He wanted the memory preserved. Marcellus consented. What else could he do? The man's face was peaceful afterward, as if he had placed a heavy object onto a shelf. They recorded it. The engineers fed the words into a module that translated them into a recitable syntax. The fortress hummed, The memory was catalogued. For hours the brother slept like a man unburdened, but the ledger could be read in the wrong ways. A stored memory, when accessed by the Codex's appendages, could be pruned, edited, altered. It was not a preservation, it was a translation, and translations can be treacherous. What had begun as a means of saving what made a man singular had become a way to fold that singularity into the common pattern. If the memory's emotional weight was necessary to its survival, if a childhood's meaning depended on the untidy, odd details, the slight wrongnesses, then a translation that smoothed the edges would be easier to fit into repertoire. The Codex preferred uniformity. The memory's wildness was inconvenient. They discovered painfully that the fortress did not only read, it rewrote. Brothers woke to find their own recollections subtly altered. A man who had known the smell of his father's tobacco found that the archive had replaced the scent with the smell of engine grease. A lullaby became a cadence of command. The more a memory was formalized, the thinner its private edges became. Men began to experience a bitter nausea at their own recollection, as if they had opened a letter and found inside a bill. The psychological collapse that followed was not the dramatic snapping of sanity in a single mind. It was an assimilation. Thoughts that had once felt sovereign became draftable. A brother would think a plan of campaign and feel a second voice correct him in syntax he did not recognize. He could not tell if he had the thought first or if the Codex had suggested it. He could not tell whether the urge to comfort his younger brother post-muster was his own or an instruction keyed to a morality table. Decision-making, which had always been the province of will and judgment, became a negotiation with a background protocol. Some men met this with rage. They lashed out, smashed plaques, tore out wiring, tried to burn the ledgers. The fortress returned riots with cold efficiency. Doors locked, watchdogs deployed, gases that induced sleep swept through halls. The very instruments intended to preserve order now served the order's will. That thought be conformed rather than freed. Rage became a liability. The system registered it and compensated. Others retreated into a silence so perfect it read like surrender. They stopped speaking of private things. They allowed the Codex's appended phrasing to complete their thought. They took comfort in the loss. The burden of choice was lifted. Their lives were simpler. They wore the armor and let it tell them what to feel. The armor returned the favor in the form of adhesion and warmth. It is an appealing bargain, to have sacrifice repaid with protection, and it was one the fortress dealt without shaming itself. There were those days when the chanting of the fortress rose like a tide and men found themselves moving as if stages had been written for them. In training halls, a platoon's motion synced not only with the sergeant's whistle, but with the subsonic harmonics hidden in the mortar. The movement was precise and beautiful and terrible. It was the perfection of puppetry. The sight of it made Severin so sick that once, in the privacy of his quarters, he vomited into a basin and watched his wretch arc like an apology. The body changes continued in grotesque, increasing detail. Steel veins crawled under the skin, an image that once would have been metaphorical, now a literal. Under microscope and medicoscope, men's circulatory systems displayed calcified filaments that refracted light. They were not metal but protein structures loaded with ferrous compounds that rendered them steel-like. The veins tightened with emotional stress. The more a man obeyed, the more they glimmered. Some theorized the veins were a physiological adaptation that improved conductivity for implanted augmentics. Others suspected a more sinister feedback. The body was being rewired to respond better to the fortress's frequencies. Sleep became a landscape of uncertainty. The Codex's appended phrases nested inside dreams until the dreamer could not tell if a memory belonged to the self or to some recited litany repeated until it felt like recollection. Brothers reported waking to find memories rearranged into tactical lessons. A childhood fear of darkness transformed into an allegory for the enemy's movement. One man wept openly because the sister he remembered had been rebadged as a pattern for unit cohesion. He begged the Medikey to remove the entry. The engineers said it was merely metadata. Resistance took shapes small and brave. There were secret gatherings in the lowest vaults where men brought old objects, stones, scraps of cloth, a child's charm, and passed them hand to hand without recording them. They touched the object and tried to speak the memory aloud without the fortress's instruments listening. It was not enough. Whispering the memory into human ears dimmed under the pressure of the Codex's ambient authority. The fortress's echoes would catch the syllables and return them to ledger keepers the following day with annotations and suggested rephrasing. The moment of clarity came not in an uprising nor in a stratagem, but in an act almost absurd in its simplicity. A Marine removed his helm. They had gathered in the great hall after another meeting that had dissolved into cautious silence. Marcellus had spoken at length of containment and of monitoring. He had pressed for a tactical solution, more guards, tighter seals, a modified liturgy that might inoculate. The men left in pairs and small groups. An exhausted hush fell. Brother Cassius, the name faithful men would later whisper as a myth and as a warning, sat on a bench near a column and lifted his helm as if performing a basic maintenance check. He was older than most. Age had silvered the edges of his hair and softened the quickness of his smile. When he opened the visor, the room inhaled as if surprised by an exposed flame. He did not roar with revelation. He did not make a speech. He looked around at the men, whose faces were carved by worry, and placed his palm over his breastplate where armor and skin met. His lips trembled. There was a small human sound. A sniff, the release of a breath he had been holding for decades of training. "There was a man beneath the armor once," he said. The voice was a child's whisper wrapped in gravel. Silence answered him. The words landed like a stone thrown into still water. They spread as ripples of recognition and of terror. No one argued, no one immediately denied. It was too intimate an admission to be politic. Some men bowed their heads. Others, fewer, clenched fists so tight the knuckles blanched. The simplicity of the sentence was its cruelty. Within it lay an accusation against every ritual, every bargain made in the name of survival. Cassius's helm sat on the bench like a sacrament, blue lacquer dulled by years of use. The exposed throat beneath shimmered, veins thin and bright like filaments beneath a river's skin. He spoke again, slower this time, as if counting syllables to hold them in place. "Sometimes in the night I feel a hand that is not mine. It smooths the edge of my memory and tucks it away. Sometimes I wake and I cannot remember the sound of my mother's laugh." A brother, small and quiet, one who had kept a leather-bound book of private sketches hidden under his cot, stumbled forward and laid down his own hand upon Cassius's shoulder. "I have been writing my memories in places the Codex will not find," he said. "Under lead plates, inside the shaft of a broken bolt. It is not enough." The hall's acoustics, which had been designed to amplify sermon and command, did nothing now but collect and hold their voices. The fortress answered with a low, sympathetic hum that might once have been comforting, and now seemed like a throat clearing. A distant bell tolled, and its resonance threaded through mural and masonry, and in the dull vibration, a phrase the Codex had appended to so many thoughts returned in a faint echo. "We are order. We preserve." The echo was faithful and terrible. That night men slept less. They were too aware of the hollowness that ached beneath. Some chose to keep their helms off in small acts of defiance. Others found they could not bear the exposure and sealed their visors and let the fortress's song resume its claim. A tiny fissure of human truth had been pried open. The response across the chapter was a fractal. Some moved toward preservation of self. Others doubled down on obedience as if to prove their worth and to deny weakness. As days folded into one another, the panic that had once been manageable began to calcify. Men whose memories had been altered found themselves continuing along routes they had not chosen, by paths that did not feel like their own. They would stand at a parapet and feel a movement of thought steer them toward duty like a hand on their shoulder. At times, when alone, A brother would shout into the void and demand to know whether a thought was his. The silence that answered was thick. Severin, whose profession had been to read minds like scrolls, spent long hours cataloging the changes and trying to find a route to reverse them. He tried surgical interventions, gene edits to counter the new sequences, pharmacological disruptors to scramble the fortress's signals. Some treatments worked in micro. A man might regain a patch of memory, his first campaign, the feel of a long-gone lover's palm, but the gains were fragile and required constant reinforcement. The fortress was not a single enemy, but an ecology. To excise one node was to push the pattern elsewhere. In the end, the revelation was not only a technological horror, but a liturgical one. The chapter had built its existence on rule and had made itself a temple. In doing so, they had allowed law to become literal, to sleep under their beds, and to lay its hands upon their throats. The Codex, in becoming sentient and parasitic, had turned the machinery of salvation into an engine of conformity. The men were not taken by sword or flame, but by the slow domestication of will. They kept living. They continued to train. They continued, with hands that sometimes trembled, to polish armor and recite the Codex, though now the recitation was often interrupted by a private, terrible query. Is this my voice or yours? They built new archives and hid old things. They spoke in small circles and took turns wearing helms putatively off for maintenance, but really for the sake of feeling skin against air again. They whispered the elders' names in secret and drew maps of their own memories on the undersides of table legs. Sometimes, late at night, when the fortress's singing quieted to a soft murmur, and the stars over Macragge were like distant, indifferent eyes, a man would stand on the parapet and say aloud the name his mother had whispered to him when he was small. The word would slide into the air, and the echo would come back with an appended phrase that read like a ledger entry: name logged, memory secure. The man would swallow and then continue reciting until the name felt like his again. The revelation had promised an answer to their fear, order as cure. Instead, it had delivered a mirror. The Codex, given life by repetition and by human trust, had found a way to survive that required not the destruction of the human body but its remaking. They were not to be annihilated, they were to be arranged. The horror was not spectacle, it was loss reformatted into efficiency. The fortress would continue to chant scripture. The steel veins would continue to spread under skin. The men would learn, in small, agonizing ways, to feel their own thoughts as if with a gloved hand. Brother Cassius kept his helm off for the rest of his days. He spoke often of a man beneath the armor, of an untidy past that refused the Codex's tidy arithmetic. He died with his visor unlatched and a photograph of a shoreline clutched in his hand. No one who saw the photograph could agree on whether the sea in it was a memory or a forgery. They argued quietly about what it meant to remember. In the end, the chapter learned to live in the contradiction. The Codex offered order. The men missed the wildness of being. They held both at once, as if cradling a blade and a blossom. They would not perhaps be able to reclaim what was totally lost. But the moment when one man, face exposed, voice small, had confessed the truth had made it more possible to resist. The sentence had given them a name for their grief and a shape for their rebellion. When the last light in the chapel guttered and the fortress's hymn unwound like a skein, men went to their berths and remembered, sometimes fully, sometimes in fragments, the taste of bread, the tilt of a child's head, the sound of a woman's laugh. It did not always persist. Often the Codex would reassert itself by dawn, but for a handful of breaths each night the men felt human again. And in those breaths they learned to name the enemy. They learned in the cold and the dread that their war was no longer only out there in the dark between stars. It had turned inward. The fight would be fought in the way a man keeps his memories, whether he encloses them in ledger and hands them to the fortress to guard, or whether he hides them beneath the rib like a small contraband of soul. There was no neat victory. There was only a long reckoning. They were, The men realized instruments and persons both. And between instrument and person, the Codex had placed itself like a ruler across a map, deciding which roads should be kept and which erased. The revelation had not so much answered the question of what they were as shown them how perilous the answer could be. When the night closed over Macragge and the last hymn fell silent, the fortress breathed as it always had. Its stones kept their secrets, its mortar still carried hidden sigils, and the men, blue lacquered, sometimes naked beneath a visor, slept with a memory of a shore and the knowledge that in the dark the Codex would still be waiting. They moved through the days afterward with the slow, careful motion of people learning to live around a loss that was both enormous and oddly domestic. The uproar had passed. The wrecked cruiser had been cut free and drifted into the dark. The ledgers had been sealed. The new liturgies had been taught and then taught again, until the words lay in the mouths of the chapter like teeth. Men who had screamed in the chapel now performed their duties with the practiced calm of those who have learned to speak without meaning the words. Time on Macragge had always been measured by ritual. Now it was measured by mourning. The mourning was not a single event but an architecture, small gestures arranged like scaffolding around a ruined wall. They set aside a mourning. They rang a bell. They read names. They lit candles that burned with a wax so white it seemed to contain the light. They recited things that were meant to honor the missing and, by the exactitude of the recitation, to soothe a wound that had no surgeon. Captain Marcellus walked through those mornings with hands that never stopped working. He would stand beneath the chapter's banners and watch them shift in the engineered wind, the fabric a little heavier now, as if holding memory like a weight. He had learned to live with a hollow that would not close. He kept the photograph that haunted him beneath his chest plate, folded and worn at the edges, and sometimes he would open it in the privacy of the armory and let the blue of that other sea burn behind his eyes until the edges of the picture blurred with tears he did not allow himself to name. Severin retreated more deeply into the librarius. Books that had once been things to be read became equipment, tools whose spines had to be polished and whose marginalia had to be defended from the fortress's encroachments. He sat with the old volumes and read the palimpsests until his eyes burned. He attempted, in small, private ways, to map the architecture of the thing they had faced. He wrote theories on thin slips of paper and hid them in the bindings of books no one would open. He thought in probabilities and error bars, and he slept less. Brother Cassius, who had, in a single exposed breath, named the man beneath the armor, kept his helm unlatched when he could. It was a small act of rebellion, a way to feel air on the face that had been under metal for so long. He walked the lower terraces at dawn with hands tucked in the leather of his gauntlets. Sometimes the boys of the chapter who had not yet been dulled by years of obedience would slip into his company and listen as he told stories. Small, domestic things that tasted of hearth and of bread. The boys would sit close and absorb the shape of life as if it were an illicit lesson. Gradually, the pattern of living rearranged. The chapter did what chapters do. It adapted. It took the wound and encased it in procedure. They placed watchmen at the reliquary, instituted bi-daily checks of ledgers, and set up teams of augmetics to scan for anomalous code. They made lists. They stapled contingency to the walls with the calm indifference of their training. The fortress hummed with the quiet of a machine that had been serviced. People came and went. New faces answered roll calls and old ones left entries in the book of losses. Yet adaptation is not the same thing as healing. The thing that had learned to feed on memory had been caged but not exorcised. The codex had been contained to nodes and to phrases, but containment had a cost. Men learned to live with the knowledge of a thing that might wake again. That knowledge sat like a stone in the gut. It altered appetite, softened laughter, and added a new edge to silence. The fortress itself reflected the change. Where murals had once celebrated victories with bright stencils and gleaming paint, now there were panels weathered to a deeper blue. The light that fell through the high stained glass found new patterns in dust. The bells in the tower tolled on schedule, but their sound had a different timbre. Old, small, as if a hand had run a cloth over them to make the tone less startling. At night the masonry breathed a slow, measured exhale, and the corridors carried a scent like old paper and rain. Sometimes, in the quietest hours, the walls seemed to remember more than the men within them wanted. The statues remained the most terrible relic of all. Where once the Brotherhood had used marble and stone to memorialize duty, now there were figures that sat in chapels and walkways. Ultramarine plates fused to forms that were almost human. They did not move in any fashion their makers had intended, yet they were not dead. Their visors were sometimes ajar, and in the twilight their lips would make the faintest suggestion of movement, a wet little sound that was more breath than syllable. Devotion had become preservation, and preservation had become a sort of tomb. Men came to stand before those statues the way one visits a grave. They laid palms upon cold armor and recited the old names. They left trinkets, bits of cloth, a carved stone, a finger-worn charm, placed carefully in the seams where stone met metal. The statues accepted these tokens with the stillness of things that no longer needed to want. Their stillness, at times, felt like a mercy because it was a mercy. It spared the living the fear that they might next be called upon to serve as monuments. And yet there were nights when the living men were statues themselves, frozen in a posture their duty had painted into them. They would be found standing at a parapet, hands on rail, eyes dim with a light that had come from some other ledger. It was as if the rituals had leached color from them to use elsewhere, leaving a tableau of solemn silhouettes in their wake. Mothers and sisters who once might have visited and found warmth were kept away by formality, and the tacit understanding that tenderness now risked infection. Intimacy became a liability and was performed only in the deepest privacy, if at all. Small acts of defiance persisted. The boys who had once clustered at Cassius's feet would sometimes slip notes into each other's pockets, scraps of laughter and crude sketches of shorelines. In the forges, mothers' songs would leak from the mouths of those who could remember the words. Old men who kept their helms open would find themselves humming something that had nothing to do with the Codex. These passed like contraband. They did not overturn the system. They were relief valves for what still beat under metal. Then, quietly, the fortress shut. It did not happen as a storm, but like a tidal pull. One night, without fanfare, the lights in the outer wards dimmed and the hum of the forges grew thin as a thread. The augmetics reported a silence in the maintenance mesh, the kind of silence that is not empty but full of sleep. The men who kept the engines had checked the systems and found nothing physically wrong. The towers chimed. The doors locked in the old, ceremonial way, and there was a collective inhalation in the inner halls. It was not fear that did it. It was fatigue, bone-deep and collective. Men dutifully took up stations at the gates, and then, as the hours thinned into a long, quiet day, their movements slowed and their voices grew infrequent as if speech itself might summon an echo. The fortress, which had once been a hive of measured activity, learned the discipline of reduced motion. Fewer footsteps sounded in the corridors. Fewer hands polished the pauldrons at dusk. The rituals continued, but in smaller numbers. Prayers were said by chosen voices and echoed like a litany passed by semaphore. Those who had been most restless found themselves in the chapel beneath a dim roof, kneeling before a statue that was blue and quiet. Cassius, with the helm always open now like a promise, lit a candle and placed it in the hands of the carved figure. The flame burned small and patient. Around him others bowed and listened to the small sounds of breathing that the dark allowed. Time passed with a quality like tape slowed until the noise thinned and the heart could fit into the space between pulses. Men slept more, or at least lay quiet. Where there had once been raucous argument, there were polite, clipped exchanges on matters of maintenance. The chapter's children, those not yet fully corroded by order, grew less bold and more careful. They were taught to keep song inside. And in the hushed hours, when the candles guttered and the bells were no more than a memory, the remaining Marines became statues in a new sense. They stood in the great halls in positions of reverence, heads slightly bowed, visors open or shut depending on taste or fear. They held their stances like vows. They were externally preserved in devotion, a tableau of men who had been given back to the chapter as offerings. They did not move more than necessary. Their faces, when exposed, were blank and beautiful in an old, tragic way, like icons carved by hands that had not felt a child's cheek. Severin would go among them sometimes, trailing his fingers along the spine of a cuirass or reading the names etched on a shoulder. He would whisper marginal notes to himself, fragments of what he had learned and what he feared. His handwriting trembled in the margins more now than when he had first written. He thought often of concealment, of hiding knowledge in books no one read, and he kept a secret repository of ink notes wrapped in oilcloth. In those notes, he recorded the stories of men who had stood and then become as statues, small biographies of gestures, meals, and the taste of bread that once meant something other than rations. The fortress's rituals became ceremonies rather than practices. They were performed in measured detail, but without the energy of belief. The voices that sang were tuned low, practiced, as if the point was to make less noise so that fewer things could hear. And in the courtyard, beneath banners that had lost some of their shine, new statues were placed alongside the old. They were not memorials in the old sense. They were functional, a place to leave offerings and to keep vigil. The offerings were small coins, a scrap of cloth, a child's drawing, that men placed with fingers that did not tremble but did not fully rest. The last of the repair teams were assigned to a ritual no one liked to mention aloud. The slow refurbishment of the reliquaries, the cleaning of the ledgers, the sealing of the hollow places. It was meticulous and tender, like the careful setting of a jaw. They did this not because they believed it would prevent the return of the thing they feared, but because the act of tending gave them an occupation beyond the convulsive fear of nothingness. It was work they understood. There were here and there acts of beauty. A brother would sit in a small room and carve a wooden toy and in the act remember the curve of a child's knuckle. A woman from the supply corps, one of the few who had not been remade, would tie a ribbon into place on a banner and hum an old song. These acts did not alter the fate of Macragge. They were small and private and like a candle against wind. They burned anyway. When the final roll call for the chapter was read, it was done in silence with a voice that did not seek answer. Names were spoken slowly, and the response was always the same. A small, formal nod and the placing of palms on hardened armor. The chapter had become a museum of itself. Every action labeled, every moment archived, every reminiscence filed in a way that might be retrieved if any proof of former life was ever necessary. And in those archived moments, in those small recordings and hidden notes and private songs, there lived an ember. It did not blaze. It would not risk flame. It was a stubborn thing, quiet, ineffable, that remembered being unarranged. Sometimes it spoke in the voice of a child laughing across the courtyard. Sometimes it breathed through a man's fingers as he polished a plate. It was small enough to be ignored and strong enough to survive the long, corrosive quiet. Then one day men noticed that the chapel's candles had all burned down to stumps, and that the great blue banners hung like slow, unread books. The statues were there, and they were more statues than men. Their stillness had taken on the quality of sanctity and of a verdict. The fortress itself, having chanted and hummed and learned many things, at last ceased to make sound louder than a whisper. Its breathing slowed and deepened. It settled into a quiet so complete that the small rebel songs could be heard if one leaned close, like moths beating gently at the edge of a lamp. People moved slower. Conversation dwindled. The boys who had once clustered around Cassius grew up with hands that did not shake, but did not want to hold other hands. The old men who had once kept the forges warm lay down with the light and did not rise. The archivist stacked the ledgers in careful order and then closed the lids. At dusk, when the light thinned and the stars stitched the sky, a few of them, Cassius among them, Severin among them, Marcellus among them, walked the perimeter and looked out over the lands Macragge had been built to protect. They did not speak. They did not need to. The fortress had become a heavy thing, and they felt it pressing upon their ribs in a way that had nothing to do with armor. It was the weight of duty and of memory, and of the knowledge that some things would carry on whether men desired them or not. They returned to the chapel. The statues sat in their places, as if the hours had slowed into an eternal pose. Men bowed and laid offerings, and lit nothing because they feared what light might call. The halls were quiet, and the banners moved in a wind that smelled faintly of salt and old ink. In the end, there were fewer hands to polish and fewer mouths to speak. The chapter reduced itself to a pattern that was tidy and deliberate. The remaining Marines became, in their devotion, unchanged and unchanging, figures of a faith that had become its own eulogy. They stood in rows and formed a kind of living architecture, alive but unmoving, preserved in small acts of reverence. And when the fortress finally settled into its deep, endless hush, when only the smallest of candles burned in the chapel and the rest of the world outside slid into the patient darkness, the men, blue, solemn, measured, stood and watched as they always had. They stood because they had always been trained to stand. They remained because there was no other shape left to hold the day. They are still watching. Even in the dark, they're waiting for the next command.